So there's an ancient story that we've all heard before that goes something like this. There's two armies in two different valleys standing face to face, about to go to each other in battle. In ancient Greek, there was a term for what would occur, monomachia. The armies would have one person represent the entire army, the hero of the whole army that would face the other army in battle and represent all of the troops. The most famous example of monomachia is in Homer's Iliad, where Hector and Achilles, equally strong, powerful men, face each other and fight to the death, and they stand for the entire army so that there's not that many deaths. The story that I want to tell is an example where you have a big military hero, a giant, with lots of armor and lots of weapons, saying to the other side, "Find your hero to come and face me on battle." He put fear in them such that for every day, the entire army quaked at this giant of a warrior. For 40 days, he said, "Bring your best." And no one could stand up to him. One day, you might start to recognize this story, this little boy comes to bring food, and he meets his brother, and his brother says, "Yeah, we don't have anyone to face up to this big giant in battle." The little boy says, "I'll do it." They all laugh, they all mock him. They're like, "This guy is so huge and so powerful, you have no chance." The little boy says, "I am willing to do it, give me the chance." They try to give him armor, they try to give him weapons. He says, I don't even feel comfortable with this stuff. I don't even know what I'm doing with this stuff. He goes and he faces this giant with a slingshot, and you've heard the story. He kills the giant and becomes king. This is the first example of Israel versus Palestine, what was then called the Philistines and the Hebrews, facing each other in battle a long time ago. It's also an example of asymmetric conflict. You have this great giant instilling fear in the whole army, and you have this little boy. A few weeks ago, in Ferguson, Missouri, you have a similar kind of asymmetry. You have a military police force, or a militarized police force, with lots of arms, lots of weapons, lots of strength, and you have kids with stones. I see it symbolized in this picture. A boy with a rock standing up against a tank. And the entire Western world is telling the boy with the rock, "Put that rock down," and not addressing the tank. This past week, there were elections in Israel, and no one mentioned the Palestinians or peace whatsoever. In the words of The Economist from this past week, it was like the Palestinians were the ghosts behind this election. Invisible, voiceless. And if they do come out in the news, they're portrayed as terrorists, having to use methods unlike the armies equal to each other in battle. Now, examples of asymmetry are seen all through our neighborhoods, even close to home. This past week, I was walking through the Smoky Mountains, and I realized, while hiking by myself for 20 miles, because I'm a male, I can hike by myself. If I was a female, I would feel afraid of hiking through the mountains when I see guys with guns. Even if they might be very kind and want to just shoot animals, it would still be super scary. And so, just that kind of asymmetry we don't even recognize on a daily basis. Last summer, I was in Istanbul, Turkey, and I helped organize a conference, along with many others, of about 400 people on peace. And our entire goal was to bring Israelis and Palestinians in the same room, not to even talk to each other face to face, but to be able to even hear each other. Now, I use this example of a conference to speak. At this conference, I met someone named Nadia Harhash, who has a daily blog about what it's like to live in the Palestinian territories every day, with walls much higher than the Berlin Wall, with checkpoints where she has to bring her little kids through every day, where she fears for her life every day. And I met Nadia, and she shared with me on Facebook this picture. Now, I use this picture as an example in my classes all the time because it's an example of what happens every day when we view media, or when we read the newspaper, or when we see any kind of image, is that we just believe what we see immediately. Now, I look at this image, and I study it, and I go, here's children in prison, or you can make up whatever story you want in a way. This, of course, you can go online and find many tales about this picture. Now, when I tell my students, I say, this picture is prisoners in Gaza. It leads them to think a certain thing. Another way of interpreting this picture is to say, this is a fabricated picture to get you to feel a certain way. Now, I think of all media a bit like this. What do we believe? When we read or watch television or see any kind of image, how do we assess or critique any kind of images or any kind of text that we read? How do we see what's behind a text or an image like this? Now, I can't tell my students or any of you that this image is certainly kid prisoners in Palestine or in Gaza. Nor can I say it's entirely fictional or made up. The truth is somewhere in the middle. In this conference, and here's the session that we had, and Nadia is the second to the right, and another woman that I've been working with who's Jordanian named Naveen Bundokji is in the middle, and we had a session on Hamas, a democratically elected political group in Israel that, already using that word is a little bit, should strike some fear in you. Whether it's, we're going to talk about two-state or whatever solution there might be, my point is not to demonize one side or another, but to point out asymmetry. This discussion in Istanbul included different voices at the table, representing different positions and not just the most powerful. I wanted to first mention Michael Gross, who is an Israeli professor in Haifa, who wrote a book called Moral Dilemmas of Modern War, Torture, Assassination, and Blackmail in an Age of Asymmetric Conflict. And I didn't just use these as props, but I brought them to show even in books that we read, we are choosing a side. Even when we read certain newspapers or watch certain television shows or listen to certain media outlets, we are taking a place or taking a position in asymmetric conflict. We are making a stance. Michael Gross and Naveen Bundokji, I put next to each other. This book is published by Cambridge University Press, and it's all about asymmetry and how torture, assassination, and other means are used in order to try to balance the scales. It's much easier to find on Amazon, for example, whereas Naveen's is really hard to find. I had to get it shipped from India. It's an Indian publisher. She is almost invisible and voiceless. Her book, called Hamas, Social Identity, Violent Resistance, and Power Politics, is about how, and I have a quote here, her book from 2013, based on her dissertation, and I've worked with her for about 5 years now, and I just wanted to take one quote from it, and she gives us a prescription for what we can do to even address asymmetric warfare in our own neighborhoods. The main act of resistance, she writes, is the voyage in, to engage with the discourse of the colonizer and transform it so that it acknowledges the marginalized or suppressed or forgotten histories. She gives examples of using art, music, literature, poetry, and prayer as forms of the voyage in, acknowledging and listening for and paying attention to that which is erased from most of our media sources. She points out, and like I said about even the blog earlier by Nadia Harhash, what it's like to be on the inside of a conflict. In Hickory, for example, I work on the board of Exodus Ministries, and every day they help with prisoners coming just out of prison and adjusting back to society, with those coming off of drugs, experiencing them on a day-to-day basis, and talking to them keeps you from alienating them close to home. 2 weeks ago, I was in Selma, Alabama. Selma, Alabama is a famous place, and it is a perfect example of this asymmetry at work. What happens when someone like David stands up against someone like Goliath? 50 years ago, this month, on March 7th, 1965, 600 folk marched Edmund Pettus Bridge and got beat the living crap out of. 600. March 21st, 50 years ago today, 25,000 marched with government support from Selma to Birmingham, Alabama, and the Voting Rights Act was passed into law shortly thereafter. That is a perfect example of nonviolent resistance that overcomes a big, scary giant. Marching with about 8, here in this picture, you can see about 8, 12 to 14-year-olds I had to care for in a crowd of 70,000 people. We took part in this march. We felt the euphoria of this place, Selma, Alabama. We experienced something that, in my lifetime, I have rarely ever experienced. The feeling of solidarity and community and togetherness. I want to use one example, one story from this march. About 2 p.m. on Sunday, March 8th, this month, we were about to take part in the march with what I dubbed our we pod instead of iPod, a little group of junior high schoolers that I thought, instead of being based on the I, a we began walking in these huge crowds and bumped into an elderly gentleman, an African-American gentleman. He's probably about 80 years old. And I said to him, "Sorry." For a split second, I looked at him and I looked in his eyes and I thought, was he here 50 years ago? What has he experienced? What has he suffered in his lifetime? For a split second, I imagined that everything that he had experienced, I could share. I could empathize. I could even, without even knowing his name, experience for a split second. After saying sorry, he said to me, "We're here for peace and love." That decades of oppression response gives me room to ponder exactly what David did on that battlefield many, many, many eons ago. He had the courage and the confidence to stand up against a greatly feared enemy with lots of might and lots of power with only a slingshot. When I saw in this gentleman's eyes his lifetime for a split second, I thought, the answer is not in violence, but in peace and love.